Welcome back after lunch. My name is Christophe Sauerwein. I am the Academic Director of iCAAD, and I'm not only introducing that panel today, it's also a great privilege for me to have been asked and allowed to facilitate it, which is things I do. And this panel goes straight to my heart for different reasons, and I'm going to explain you why. The timeline of catastrophic trauma, understanding the lifelong transgenerational impact of major trauma on victims, survivors, and the community. That's the theme. But there's much more there. I'm a trauma therapist, and I work with patients who are seeking for help, and it's a privilege to be part of the journey and trying to help. We usually at iCAAD speak about methodology, models, different things, and this time it's an unbelievable opportunity. We have today two women who are therapists, and I'll introduce you more after, but they're also going to share their story, and it's very humbling. And I am really sharing that with you, and I believe that you will share the respect I have for Kathleen and Raja. We agreed also that I would share with you that you may be triggered by the story. There will be storytelling. We're not talking technique here. We're talking human experience and human pain. You may be triggered. If you are, please own it. If you need to maybe get out and just breathe and come back, it's absolutely okay. I don't want to catastrophize all that, but I need to name it, right? And maybe get some help. We're here to help because triggers is part of the human process. It's normal. And there will be storytelling, story sharing in this panel. I think it's important. It's important because it's the first time at iCAAD that we look at all that from the pain in the intimate experience, but also from a professional way, about how it is to be in our life, day after day, and one day, all of a sudden, something happens, and life will never be the same. And we'll have to live with that. We'll seek for help. We'll help ourselves. We'll develop spirituality, different things. But life will never be the same. And this is what we are looking at today, all together, sharing also our own life, listening to those beautiful stories of pain and transformation and recovery. This is what we're sharing today. There's much more than therapeutic technique here in this room, and I think you understand that you can hear my voice when I speak. So please, let's be together with that. I'm not going to tell more about that. I'm just going to introduce you, Kathleen and Raja. And before that, you may see on the program that three people were meant to be on the panel. Julie Thompson, who is the Commissioner to survivors and victims in Northern Ireland and in Belfast, sadly sent us an email yesterday. Things are not easy at the moment in Belfast, so there was no way she could fly over to London. I have no idea what's happening, but there was good reason for her not to be able. So she apologized, but she sent her notes to Kathleen, and Kathleen will actually speak on her behalf at some point. This is, I think, the best way we can bring her in, even though she is not there today. And we also have to understand that, it is tough what's happening over there. But the people, the communities, and her duty is to be there. So, KATHLEEN O'HARA, I think we know each other pretty well. We work next door. And you're a therapist with 25 years of experience. You specialize on helping victims of trauma, women a lot. You wrote a fantastic book that I cherish and I recommend, actually. A 'Grief Like No Other One'. 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 'Grief Like No It's a self-help group about grief like I've never seen any other one, by the way. It's a really, really powerful, poignant book. You consult with the United States Department of Justice, you speak at the United Nations, and you've been helping in the Middle East a lot of refugee, traumatized women in the recent past, and you also exist in London. Raja, you're a therapist specializing in young population, and you intervene into schools, trying to put community system, mainly in West London. I think you're doing an unbelievable battlefield work. It means a lot, and also for some reason you're going to explain. You created a support group called My Shepherd. My Shepherd was created nearly a year ago after the Grenfell fire, and because of the Grenfell fire, and we'll learn more about that. I think I don't want to over-expand. Please, thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name's Rajat, and I'm an integrative therapist, and at the moment I'm a school counsellor. Obviously I'm going to give you a brief description of why I started the service called My Shepherd. It might affect some of you, obviously we haven't come to the point where we've reached the year, but I started this service because I lost 5 family members in the tragic fire that happened in June 14th, last June. And kind of, I'm still going through the process of kind of understanding why it happened, so I'm also still grieving myself. But the service that I've started with other therapists is about supporting the community and supporting young people, to kind of help them deal with the trauma. My experience in this is that if I go back to the night that it happened, I'm not going to lie, it's not something that I can forget. You know, I was there from when the fire started. Unfortunately, I still live opposite the building, so I do see that building every single day. You know, I've got a massive role in the community because obviously I live there and I work with a lot of young people, and the impact it's having on the community and myself and my family, it's still, you know, prolonging. So if I can sit and still try and reflect on my own feelings, which sometimes I do find a bit difficult because I'm a therapist, so I try to kind of not be a therapist to myself, it's hard. And I'm going to be it's very, very hard to know that something like that can happen in a country like this, and to me, justice still hasn't paid off. You know, the courts haven't started yet. I'm hearing the community are still grieving, the community are still dividing, you know, but I think with the service that I've designed, it's more based around the young people, where it's giving the young people a voice, where they can come and express how they feel. Because what I've noticed, where I live, the young people have lost the voice. They've lost the trust to local authorities. They've lost the respect to the local authorities. So the service that I've done, and thanks to Kathleen, she's helped a lot, is to be able to give them that space where they can explore a feeling that they've never felt before. A level of trauma, to be honest, I don't think anyone I know has ever come across. Yeah. I think that's it.
You're about to die.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think it's more based around, if I can go back to the night that it happened, and I will, like I said, I still remember what happened. I remember talking to my family. I think the reason why I'm trying to avoid talking about it because I don't want to get emotional, but I remember talking to my family on the phone, asking them to leave the tower, but unfortunately they didn't. I had 2 family members in the tower. One lived on the 9th floor, but thank God she'd come out with her family, and the remaining was my uncle that lived on the 21st floor. Sorry. We're coming to the anniversary now, and what I've decided with a few other therapists is that we are trying to create something for the young people to present on the memorial, and you know, we're kind of bringing up some ideas of how they want to express their feelings. We've got some of them that I said they want to do poetry. Some want to join the Silent March, because I don't know if any of you lot have heard that every month on the 14th there's a Silent March, and there will be one on the 14th to mark the year, where the young people will be presenting all the stuff that they've kind of wanted to tell the deceased of how they've been feeling and they miss them. So we'll be working towards that. But as I said, I'm still myself going through the grieving process. You know, I think by doing this service has actually helped me slightly to be able to manage my own level of grief. I've got an amazing support network around me. I've got amazing friends, I've got amazing family, I've got amazing colleagues. That's kind of helped me deal with my own level of grief. But I think also by doing a service like this has also helped me manage myself to be able to support the young people I work with. I've done things like this in the past where I've supported women with domestic violence because I've understood where they've come from. So by doing this, it gives me the opportunity to be able to deal with my own trauma. I know some therapists would disagree with that because they think it's too close to home, but for me, actually having the experience, what these people have gone through, from the loss, from the anger that you're feeling, from the betrayal, and it is betrayal from the system because we do feel let down through the system. This, to me, is an opportunity for me to sit down with these young people and actually say, I understand what you're going through. I understand how angry you are, but you know what? We are going to get over it. We're not going to forget it. I'm going to be very honest. It's not going to be forgotten, but we're going to be able to move forward. And I think that's what we're trying to do as a community and as my family. We are trying to move forward, but at the same time, it is a slow process, but you know, we will get there.
How's the family has rebuilt or trying to rebuild itself? Your immediate, non-extended family. Would you like to share about
Yeah, my family, I think everyone's, because we're a very big family, I guess everyone's dealing with it in their own way. Like, you have my uncles and aunties that still to this day don't believe it's happened. My mother, for example, she can't look at the tower, where I have my father, where he's also proactive in the community, doing a lot for the community. You know, I guess everyone's dealing with it with their own way, but my concern is how the young children are dealing with it, because they're not aware of the level of trauma that it's impacted. And what I found out in the community and also amongst my family is that there's not many things out there for younger children or younger people. So when I do try to support the younger people in my family, it's very hard to get them to understand without getting them to express their anger. So at the moment, I think what it is that my aunties and uncles are trying to deal with it, where they've come to the point of they've accepted it, but at the same time, for the younger generation, it's like we shouldn't accept it because it shouldn't have happened. So that's kind of, it's like kind of like a 50-50 limbo where some have accepted it and some haven't, but it's more the younger generation that haven't accepted it.
In terms of trying to envisage the future, how can we see a life in front of us? Yes, Raja. I think in terms of restoring a vision for the future, being stuck in this place of grief, in also sharing that with the family member at different levels and different stages, how do we restore can we restore this vision of, okay, there is a tomorrow, there is a next year, there may be an end to that tunnel. Is this crossing your mind yet? Or?
It does cross my mind, but I think it depends on the level where they are. And I think that's when it comes to therapy, because some members of my family have gone into therapy because it's something that they felt that they needed to do. But I think if we start thinking about the future, at the moment now, working with the young people, and for myself, I don't think I'm there yet. So I myself am taking day by day. And by doing that is making sure that I'm supported. I've got support from my own personal therapist. My family and friends are supporting me. So to me, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but this is something that's never going to be forgotten. This is something we're going to have to live with, you know, forever. But it's about moving forward, but knowing that that feeling is still there and how we manage it.
Thank you, Raja.
Thank you.
The way we organize that is that I'm going to ask Kathleen to share also her life experience around her own trauma, and then maybe you'll explain or you convey the message from Judith, and then we'll get very quickly into question answers, and maybe I'll bring back some new questions. You okay with that? Okay. Thank you, Raja. Thank you.
And thank you, Raja, for, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Raja, for sharing that. I know personally that it is not easy in the first year to reveal what's going on with yourself and to tell that story. It's extremely difficult. So I commend you for allowing yourself to be vulnerable to do that, because I remember back to my first year and it was very, very difficult. And the first year is still coming up. The anniversary is June 14th for the fire and for all of the people who experienced it. In terms of my own story, I was living in Philadelphia at the time, near my own family. And my son, Aaron, was a student at Franciscan University in Ohio. And that is a small Catholic university, 1,200 kids. Aaron went there because he wanted to live the life that the Franciscan friars made their own, which was love, charity, service. I was already a therapist for 7 years. So one day, Memorial Day, it'll be 19 years in 2 weeks, in America, we have something called Memorial Day weekend, which is to honor the fallen soldiers of all the wars. So it was very ironic that this actually happened then. And I got a phone call from the Steubenville police. And they asked me the question that changed my life. And that was, do you know where your son is? And that just opened and began the nightmare for me. And I felt myself, my heart started to hurt. I started to sweat. I started to feel like this is very serious. What's going on? And I said, he's at the college. I just talked to him last night. What are you talking about? And they said, well, we don't know what's happened other than the house was broken into and there's blood in the room. So as a mother, I'm thinking, and then they hung up the phone. So there I was left with, okay, what happened? Going back over the conversation. He spoke to me, he was in the house. He'd actually just gone to 6 o'clock in the evening mass. He was waiting for his roommate, Brian, to come. They had just moved off the beautiful campus into a house. So we decided to drive to Steubenville the next day. We arrived and all of the students and the families gathered. And we were trying to get information. We would go to the police, we would go to the prayer services, and we couldn't get anything. All we knew was the house had been broken into and the boys were gone. And I remember going into that trauma, and I couldn't think, and I couldn't cope, yet I had the support of hundreds of people around me, so they carried me. And I remember being so upset that the first night I was there, I went out into the courtyard, and there was a beautiful tree. And all of a sudden, these 2 starlings started flying around over my head. And they flew upwards, and I looked and I saw the evening star. And a voice said to me, they're gone, but they're okay. And of course, I knew what that meant, but my mind said, no, we're going to find them. And anyway, so we ended up searching for them for 5 days, all the county and federal agencies. And we finally did find the boys, and they had been tortured and shot in the head and left there in the woods. Needless to say, this was extremely traumatizing. Apparently, their house was broken into by 2 crack addicts, And being a person who's not only in recovery, but in my early years had worked with addiction, this was the truly ugly face of addiction, because they were arraigned, they were caught because they drove right back into town, and they were arraigned by the judge, and I got to see them coming down from crack. And it was truly one of the most horrible things that I'd ever seen. And to know that that was the last thing my son saw. Returned to Philadelphia, and now I knew as a therapist that if I felt my feelings, they would eventually get better. So I was prepared, but nothing prepared me for the depth of that. I couldn't eat. I lost 25 pounds because I couldn't take I couldn't swallow, couldn't take anything in. So I would allow these feelings to come in and actually be present for them. So this idea of post-traumatic stress syndrome, I was partially, of course, had that diagnosis because of the trauma, the intrusive flashbacks, imagining what my son went through. So this went on for quite a while. And even though I would function, I would never know when a wave would come. So my life started to get very small because I couldn't go, I had to stop working, couldn't go out because I never knew what was going to happen. Plus, I had IBS as a result of that. I never knew when I would just lose it, literally. It was just so traumatic. And this went on for about a year. So I would say the first year, mercifully, shock serves as a protection for the reality, and you learn to digest it a little bit at a time. The second year, by that time I'd started eating more, but I developed this very sort of reclusive life because I couldn't let a lot of people in because I would have to tell the story and I would have to do all that. So it was just safer to be contained. My community became very small to family and friends. After the first anniversary, I realized, oh, okay, I made it through an entire year. That's the good news. The bad news is I have to do it again. And I was in somewhat denial because I was pretending he was still at college and he was going to come home, even though I knew he wasn't. And during the second year, what I describe as more depression-related trauma. I wasn't a depressed person. I had depression in relation to the post-trauma. During the first year, I had gone into counseling at something called the Anti-Violence Partnership in Philadelphia, which was started by the woman whose daughter Nancy was murdered by Sid Vicious in the Chelsea Hotel in New York. And she happened to live in Philadelphia, and I became friends with her. And I remember in my first month, she said to me, I asked her how she was. 27 years later, she said, well, usually it's a sunny day and the clouds are on the horizon and they're light gray. But sometimes the clouds move closer and I have to take care of myself. And I thought, 27 years? I was not ready to hear that. Anyway, that therapy helped because they were people who were grounded in victim services and they were grounded in this particular homicide trauma. And that is very important. The second year I had to face the trials and the murderers, and we sat through all the pictures when they found my son and all of the testimony. And this, of course, was a re-traumatization of the whole thing. And I thought, that was hard, very hard. But we did get justice. So I thought there was some kind of closure, at least on the temporal justice level. 4 years out, I had started working. I'd been asked by different organizations to come and talk to them. And I did that, and I started getting clients who had experienced this kind of trauma. And I began to see how my experience could be useful to them. And that's how I kept my son's memory alive, because I didn't want it to end on that hill. And then I decided to write a book that would help families deal with it. And I couldn't have written the book in year 2, 3. I think I wrote it at 5 years, and it was published in 2006. And then I started to become a public figure. So I had to start telling my story a lot. And what I realized through the years is I was grateful to do the service. I wasn't being quite as triggered, and now I didn't cry to the extent that I would anywhere near in the beginning. But the grief became very quiet and very insular, right? Because in my other life, I wouldn't necessarily talk about it, because it's not exactly dinner conversation. So questions like, how many children do you have? Or, oh, you know, my son is doing this, and I'm thinking, you know, they're all things that re-traumatize and re-trigger. You learn how to cope with it, but it's still extremely painful. And also you feel that alienation from the rest of the world. And apparently, during those first 5 years, all the kids who experienced this, there were 1,200 kids, all of their families also. So this was a huge community impact, as I'm sure it was in Grenfell. Because you have this idea, it's not just one family. It's hundreds and hundreds of people who've been affected by this. 10 years out, I started to really think about having a new life. And of course, I realized in the counseling I do with survivors, there is a new life, but there is no closure. There is simply a way that you transform the trauma into something you live with on a daily basis. And I can truthfully say now, 19 years later, that most of the horror from that has subsided. Talking about it, I feel like triggering in my heart right now, but the actual horror that I felt the first several years has been thankfully discharged. And what remains is, one, I'm still shocked that that could happen, that human beings do that we do that to each other. And two, that it happened in my family. And then how do I go on not seeing my son? Because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. The other thing that happened during those years is about 5 years afterwards, my two children, remaining children, and I were having dinner around Thanksgiving. My husband had passed away 7 years before of a heart attack. So in some ways, I was almost thankful that he did not have to go through that. We get a call from the Steubenville Victim Service Provider and says, by the way, the guilty verdict has been overturned. They are still in prison, but they're going to have to be retried again. So that, of course, re-traumatized and until 2011, so that was 2005, I think, we had to sit through every 6 months them telling us there'd be a new trial, giving us a date, and then changing it. So one thing to realize, and I think Raja could definitely talk about this as well, is that in these types of trauma situations, it's not only the grief, as if that wasn't enough. There's a parallel process in the justice system. Because when someone does something to the one you love, we do have laws, and you want justice. When you don't get that justice, it's so much harder to heal, because it's an outrage that the law has not protected you, number one, and number two, you have not gotten the punishment that you think is equivocal to the life. By the way, when they were finally tried again, I got the justice, but did it bring my son back? No. And that's the really sad thing, is that when you take a life, there is no justice for that, because that life can never be restored. And I think this is very important to realize in the therapeutic process. Should you counsel people like us to realize that we will never be restored? We can heal, but there is nothing that is going to, it's just never going to be as good. I remember watching a video called Strong in the Broken Places. And Thich Nhat Hanh, the wonderful meditator, was talking about, the million of his fellow citizens who were murdered in Cambodia. And there were several people telling their story, and what they said was, we've all healed tremendously, but like a broken leg, you will never heal completely. And I know this goes against, quote, psychological theory, and I've run across this when I've trained. By the way, after my book, I became a trainer for clergy, therapists, police, district attorneys, lawyers all over the world, including South Korea. And it's something that I run across a lot, which is preconceived notions that therapists have about, quote, healing trauma. And I think this is really key, that if you find yourself in this situation, I would ask you to ask yourself what you would do if you were in that situation. Not the theoretical stance, but the experience of that human being. And then you will quickly realize there's no fixing this. And the reason why victims don't get the care that we need, and I see Rajesh, because we've had this discussion, is that therapists have their agenda of what they think a good victim should be like. And this, by the way, is a big topic of victimology. Good victim versus bad victim. Who's cooperative? Who heals from their trauma? And you have very well-meaning people wanting to rush us through something that is not going to happen. So I don't know how many of you are in the therapeutic community, but to really listen to what, and Raja, if you want to add something to that?
I definitely agree. I think as a therapist, going through such a traumatic event, it's very hard to overcome that. And I know, putting on my therapist hat, we do want to make sure our client gets better, but you can't, because the client mentally never gets better. They're going to live with it, but they're going to find their own healing process. But nothing's, it's not going to go away. It's just about helping them manage it. So, and I think that's a big thing as a therapist we all should know, is that helping the client to manage that level of trauma, because it is a big trauma, whether what had happened to me, what had happened to, to you, it's big traumas, and it's just about living with it.
And again, and developing resilience and strength in those broken places. So it's not to say, for either of us, to say that we won't have beautiful, wonderful days. In fact, I believe in what the Buddhist philosophy about suffering is. The world is full of suffering, but the jewel of suffering is compassion. And so being able to join into that and realize that now your broken heart is open, and that you can really enjoy things when the joy returns, because for years there was no joy. I tried, trust me, and I just could not get it. But today I can. It's amazing. I can get joy from a simple flower and see the most profound beauty in it. And I think that is a result of great suffering. Gives us the ability to understand things. At the same time, I don't have a lot of tolerance. I still have that triggered response, and I have to watch it very carefully, especially if I get tired, is that if I feel like I'm threatened, there'll be a sensation of something in the background that reminds me of when things were really bad. So I have to be very careful to stop, and I can't always stop. So the triggering is 90% better? Probably some people are saying, wow, what was it like? But there's still a percentage that is automatic. And I wonder about this, whether the brain fully recovers its pre-traumatic response. And that when put under pressure, there's a reactive response that starts to happen that is almost automatic. You know, and I'm a meditator, I've been a meditator for probably 30 years. I'm not sure how I would have coped with Aaron's death without that. Am I over the time? Yeah, am I good? And I really, so even during that, I would have, morning meditation, which would help try to get me back into the frontal cortex and out of the reaction, and so for a few moments, and then the waves would come again. And I'm a big believer in that anything you can do to reactivate the frontal cortex, which is higher executive reasoning, it does help trauma victims. Because also the other thing I think is like being held, and Raja and I were talking, would you like to say something about the holding the space for the feelings of the
I think for me it's, I allow myself to explore my own feelings, so I give myself the space. That's kind of how I experience it, but I guess everyone's different. But it depends on the level of trauma that they go through. But for me, I do give myself that time. If I know that, like you said, having that feeling of not having a good day, I know where that feeling's coming from. So yeah, that's how I deal with it.
Just ask a question. Reactivating the executive function and the frontal cortex, is helping other people actually help reactivating that, giving a congruence? Because it's an executive function helping other people, but it stays congruent with the experience of the trauma. So would you say that helping other people is actually re-engaging with life in an executive way?
I think so. I think that being able to sit with a person and understand what they're going through and try to contain it forces me, and I think most of us, into that higher level function. Now, the problem becomes if you haven't processed enough of your own trauma, it becomes more difficult. So you have to allow that space and what reaction you have to what the person is saying. So it's that therapeutic function of I'm here, but I'm also with you. Yeah. But there's a part of me that is trying to understand and can hold your emotion. That to me is the hardest part of this therapeutic work. Because what happens is people start naturally emoting, or they get very angry, the tension goes up. Now, you can either shut that down for them, that's not going to be very helpful. Or you can witness it and just hold the container, which I think most therapists are trained to do. And that's key, because in that, the transformatory process can happen, because now you're helping them with the feelings so they can start processing it. And one of the things I will say to people when I'm in there with them is, how you feel today, after they've processed, is not how you're always going to feel. And this is very helpful, because I think in these extreme traumas, the person is convinced that this is the way it's always going to be, and therefore it is impossible to live through that. And they're right. Because if that's the way it's always going to be, it's not a good prognosis. But if somehow they can understand that it's okay, this is normal, this is the new normal, but at some point, given the time, it will change. Right? Would you add to that?
I agree. I definitely, I agree with that. I think it does, it takes time, but It's about us as therapists to make sure that the client is allowed to express how they feel. I've had therapists come to me and say, the client constantly repeats the story, but that is their story, and it's about us as therapists to stay with that. No matter how long it takes, they're in that place. And for me, I've learnt to bracket my own feelings to be able to be present for my client with whatever trauma they're going through.
Right. See, this idea of repetitive storytelling, it has to happen, because the story is everything in the beginning. There is nothing else but the story. And in my book, I talk about Salman Rushdie's quote: "The person who cannot transform their story, tell their story over and over again, loses power over the story." You have to be able to transform that story, and that means constantly talking about it. Now, this is very disconcerting for people. And the other thing I would say about this, and I think this is critically important, is the experience of it. And I'll tell you a story. Years ago, when I was a therapist in Colorado, before this happened, a woman came to me and told me the story of her daughter being murdered. She opened the shop door and her daughter's bludgeoned body was in front of her. Well, and I was trying to be present, but what I realized is there was something. I didn't want to go there. I had 3 children. That was threatening to me. And this is what we do as human beings, not just therapists. The other experiences that. There's a stigma to murder. There's a shame to it. We want to distance ourselves from that because it might happen to us. So I was aware of that in the therapeutic process, and I was trying to work with that resistance that I had. When this happened to my son, I realized just how resistant I was, because I didn't want to go there. And this is something that it's a lot to ask of a therapist to be able to go there. And again, with things like suicide, homicide, drug overdose, there's a sort of thing, there's a stigma about it that we don't like. And we will defend against that. And that interferes with the therapeutic work and I think the healing or the relationship with the person. Yeah? Yes?
Well, thank you, Raja and Kathleen. Maybe this is the time, Kathleen, if you're okay, that we speak a little bit about what Judith Thompson, you forgot about it, yeah.
Completely
now,
forgot.
We'll come back to Kathleen's and Raja's experience, and we'll have time to ask questions.
Yes.
We still have time, but I think at that moment, maybe also just to objectify a bit and just give you a bit of breathing space, Kathleen and Raja,
Yeah.
it will be a good kind of diversion a bit to speak about what's going on in Northern Ireland, because there's a huge trauma there.
Right, and as Christoph said, when Judith called, she could not disclose the nature of what was happening, but it had to do with victims, and that she had to be there because if she wasn't, she couldn't do her job of protecting victims. So while she herself was not a victim, her job was to help the survivors of the Northern Ireland Troubles to get access to services they need and to get justice. Now, according to her, the paper she wrote, that over 213,000 people were affected by the Troubles and have, quote, 213,000 adults in Northern Ireland have developed mental health difficulties as a consequence of their conflict. Now that is a huge amount of people, okay? So one of the things I think that she has tried to do is, one, to get the government to recognize the impact, which they have, and they have given money towards services, and they've done a fairly good job. The difficult thing has been to get the justice on a community level for the people on both sides, because both sides were in that conflict and both sides lost people. And so now the people are much older. Some of them are dying without ever having seen justice for their families. And this lack of justice, as I said earlier, is the parallel process for victims. And when you're treating a victim who is not getting the justice, that's an important thing to consider in the treatment. So the work that she's trying to do is push the justice ahead and the government to deliver it, as well as all the services. There are successes and not successes, but Judith has been brilliant in trying to get that done. Some of the things they've created is the Victim and Survivors Forum, and she convenes a forum which comprises up to 25 members that are representative of victims and survivors, so that from that consultation she can take it forward to the government and get them to respond. I would like to read her concluding comments because I think they're very useful. In lessening the transgenerational impact of traumatic conflict-related experiences, because remember we're talking now about the transgenerational effect, it is clearly important not to compound the individual and family-based stress, grief, and loss associated with conflict-related incidents, involving both state and non-state actors. Experience of conflict-related trauma can be compounded by an insufficient recognition of the impact on mental and physical health among families, coupled with, and Roger had talked about this, with a lack of trust and transparency from those responsible state and non-state actors. Experience from Northern Ireland is that the lack of a comprehensive process to dealing with historical investigations and information recovery and effective measures to remove the threat from ongoing paramilitary activity has perpetuated the transgenerational impact of conflict-related trauma. In addressing the transgenerational impact of the conflict on population mental health, there is a need to engage in this process. One, address the high prevalence of conflict-related mental health disorders, including PTSD, depression, anxiety, and substance dependency, and to prevent young generations from being exposed to parental mental ill health. Recognize that providing timely access to evidence-based trauma-focused treatments cannot address this in isolation. In other words, it has to be integrated. It requires the establishment of a comprehensive process to tackle outstanding conflict legacy issues, including paramilitarism and lessening the potential psychosocial impact on communities. So I think that says a lot. And basically what Judith is talking about is the ongoing need for services to address an unresolved conflict state among victims. And this is particularly difficult in terms of getting justice for the people.
Thank you, Kathleen. You finished on the notion, the concept of justice, and I think I've heard you too, Raja and Kathleen. You pronounced the word justice more than 35 times. I'm quite good at counting that. So, it's my OCD. Now, justice, the societal justice, the systemic justice is about a public acknowledgement that is shared and agreed and approved by the rest of the community. It's called justice in a social and legal way. You tapped onto the spiritual justice. How can God help me, or how can God allow that, whatever the God of our understanding? And in between, my first question would be, is there a space for what I imagine right now, and I'm just speaking loud, thinking loud, for therapeutic justice? What I mean is that inside the session, in the other therapy, in this experience, there's a space for, maybe the first move is listening to your story, and that's a justice rendered to the experience of the story. But can we think about a layer of justice that is happening experientially inside the therapy?
I think you're talking about subjective justice there. So this would be a subjective experience of making sense out of the narrative and perhaps some justice. But in my mind, as a victim losing a child to homicide, I want real justice. And unless I get that, I'm not going to be happy. I may have to accept it. And believe me, through all these years that I've worked with, I can't tell you how many people have never gotten justice. They will either the perpetrator was not caught, and the evidence went missing, botched, jurisdictional issues, bad representation, collusion, conspiracy. It comes in all shapes and sizes. And this, of course, leaves the person without justice. But the internal thing, to me, would be learning to accept that. Because how can you live without, you can wait for justice and push for it, but in the meantime, you have to have some peace in your life, because it could go on for 20, 30, until the day you die. So how do you hold both of those spaces, knowing you might not get it, but pushing for it? Because otherwise, you will never have peace, ever.
Yeah, it's true. I agree. For me, getting justice is a form of closure. It's being able to know that the cause of it, those that caused it, are gonna get punished for it, whether it's a religious aspect or not. It's the fact that they're gonna get punished for what they've done, because 75 people died innocently that didn't need to die. So for me and the community, we are waiting for justice. And as the court case is coming up, you can see the tension. All we want to know is why it happened, how it happened, and why didn't these people come out of the building? And all we want is to hear the truth. And that to us is justice.
See, and that can be so it's part of the healing process, because without that, let me back up a second. Here's the bigger question. Why bother having laws?
Yeah.
Why don't we just all live in the jungle and not have any laws at all? If we're going to have laws, those laws must be enforced. And one of them is accountability for homicide or manslaughter or negligence. There must be accountability. And I think that's that sort of nuance about victims that you find, as opposed to other trauma types of victims,
Yeah.
right?
It depends, because if we look at it from a domestic violence, a woman that's gone through an abusive relationship, the perpetrator doesn't always get justice. She doesn't always get justice, because the fact that in that situation you need so much evidence, not just bruising, it's all about the psychological aspects of it. So it does depend. Some people would get the justice they deserve and others won't. Do you understand? But to me, if we don't get justice for this, then how all those people in the community, how are they going to have closure? I'm working on my closure. I've had an opportunity to go to the tower. I've gone to my uncle's floor. I've seen what's happened from how I remembered it, from when I used to go to his house to now, and it's completely changed. And to me, that opened my eyes, thinking that it did happen. I walked into his flat having this image of walking into the corridor, into the living room, into the kitchen. I went into a burnt building, was dust. That is something, I closed my eyes and I still see it. But that was, in some ways, it was towards closure. I'm working towards that, knowing it did happen, and now we're going to get justice.
You hope you get justice, but that's the question. In Northern Ireland, some have gotten some justice, many have not. And personally, I think not only does it complicate the, quote, healing process, but it can derail it.
Yeah.
But again, the question becomes, can you live in the meantime while you're waiting for this elusive thing called justice?
Yeah.
That's a key element. How do people do that? How do you support them to do that? Yeah.
What I hear really resonates with me, which is let's forget about our old approach about treatment plan and having, as you said at the opening, having an end game as a therapist. All this is extremely intimate. This is about where are we with the pain and how is it going on. And I'm just thinking that holding the space, waiting for the justice, is also a duty of the therapeutic. I never really thought about that. So we thank you for bringing that here. I would see it as a kind of social side part of the problem, a true one. But now I realize how much actually maybe the best we can do is to hold the space before the justice happens, because the time clock seems to be stopped until that happens.
Yeah.
Do I understand that properly?
Very, very much so. So, yeah.
We had the idea of just trying to address, what sort of support you would like, but I think we really into that. And I'm thinking, if you're okay, you two, maybe I would invite you, if there's someone with the microphone, to start sharing back and ask questions to Raja and Kathleen. Please. Okay, thank you. I'd like you really to speak in front of the mic for the recording purposes. Okay, even though we. To just speak really into the microphone, because we are recording all that, even though we hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Brent Clark. I used to run a addictions treatment service, and now I'm working in private practice. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your stories. You've honoured us by sharing them. I've got one statement and one question. What I found when working with people with trauma, and I think it's been reflected in what you've said, is that they have to be the boss in how long it's taking, and you have to go at their pace, and you have to validate their feelings, whatever that's what I was hearing you say, the validation of the outrageous thing that's happened is something that's really important. Would you agree with that in terms of them being the boss?
I definitely agree with that. It's about what the client brings. As a therapist, we do want to try our best to make sure the client gets to that end goal. But in this level of trauma, there is no end goal. You have to help them manage, and even though the therapeutic process does end, it's what they're going to do after that therapeutic process. So for me, I'm able to do that because I'm experiencing their level of trauma. So it's about giving them that space to whatever it is that you're bringing, this is what we're going to work with.
And just one question in terms of justice. One of the things that I ask clients when they come to me with trauma, whether it be recent trauma or childhood trauma, is if they want justice. I say, have they explored it? And my question is, what if someone doesn't want to go down the road of justice? And I've had clients before who say, I don't want to go there. It was either happened a long time ago or it's too painful. What would your suggestions be?
Yeah.
Okay, so in that case of, let's say, trauma that has already happened, sexual abuse or violation, it's very difficult. In my own situation, in terms of childhood abuse, I thought about that, like that person should pay, but I also knew that there's a statute of limitations, I'm not ready to do that, so on and so forth. So that's a little bit of a different choice. Yeah. However, in these kinds of situations, the state takes over. Yeah. You don't have a choice. You can choose not to go to the trial, you can go the other way. And some people do, very few do. But it is, once you have this kind of trauma, you are now you are part of the state actor. They will present the case. They will do exactly what they want to do. as you're going to see in Grenfell. They will proceed in the way that they think is right, which renders the client or the victim often powerless.
Yeah.
Because they take it over. In fact, when I trained victim services throughout the United States and Europe, that was one of the things, the reason for the training is to start recognizing victims, who you're representing in the court process. Sure, you have a legal protocol, an obligation, but you're representing a victim, a real victim.
Yeah.
Listen to what they're saying. Call them by name. Ask them what they want. And in America, they've started doing that. That they've started to consult with families. We have victim impact statements that influence the court. This never happened before. So again, to answer your question, there's really two ways of looking at it. In historical abuse, you may not want to, and it's two. A part of you is still a child, it's like against the big guy. It may not be practical. But again, in these situations, the state will take over for you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Does that help? Yeah?
Sorry, just first of all to voice some a gratitude to share these stories here, because it's I'm touched by what you have to say. My question is as a father, I have sort of a primal, visceral sense after hearing your story, Kathleen, that I want to go out and murder these men. I would want to physically harm them. And I guess as people within that, victims who experience that, maybe more men. I guess the question is, how do you work in a society where that's not allowed?
That is a great. And then Margie, let me just because when I was sitting across, I was sitting behind the two perpetrators. And because it's a tiny courtroom about this size, and there's and I'm thinking, I am going to kill you. I'm going to rip out your throat and spill your blood all. That's the outrage I had. Yeah. And of course, I can't do that. I have to allow the court to do it. So again, this is the bigger question. Why do we have laws? Because we ourselves cannot kill, we can't do that. So we have to rely on that higher form of justice. And the state acts for us. And that's why when you don't get that, what are you left with? You're left with that visceral feeling of, I'm going to kill that person because they took the life of someone I love. That's a natural, that is natural. In fact, when you're working with someone, and if you can't handle that, See, I appreciate your honesty in being able to say that, because that tells me you could work with a client and be able to handle that. Because if you can't, you're shutting down part of their process.
I agree. In regards of what happened to my family, I don't think I'll ever sit in front of the perpetrators. But for someone that's gone through domestic abuse and come out as a survivor, when I was working with women that had gone through it, having that feeling of knowing the perpetrator, what they had done to them, having to face them, it does bring up certain emotions, and I've been through that. So I think to myself, I still have to face my perpetrator, I still have to see him, but how do I manage that? The way that I can do it is, I've become a better person, I'm stronger, I'm better, and I'm a survivor. And that's how I encourage women that have gone through domestic violence, you can get through it. It's hard, because it does come down to the justice system. Sometimes these women don't get heard, but at the same time, time's changing. There are organisations out there that are voicing it. And again, and that's what I'm trying to do for my family, is I'm voicing for my community, this is what we are going through. This is what we have to come out and be better to be able to not let something like this happen again.
I have quite a few questions. I'll try and choose one. And I'm not sure if this is kind of completely relevant here, but I guess What about when there just isn't a perpetrator? What about when it's an earthquake? What about when justice just isn't a feature? Because what I'm hearing you say is that justice is quite an important part of the healing process. What if there isn't anyone to blame, as it were?
Right. Okay. And that's a really important question. In terms of this kind of trauma where there is someone to blame and there is a law that protects us, there's an expectation of justice. In other types of situation, a hurricane or in Haiti, for example, or the tsunami that happened, apparently the survivors felt betrayed by the ocean that they loved so much. But this is so they felt that there was an injustice. They had done something to anger the mother.
Yeah.
So they have to process in a way what Christopher, the more subjective feelings of unjust. But there isn't a legal system or requirement that goes along with that. It may have very similar commonalities, but there is no law governing that has been broken, therefore no legal justice. And that leaves them with a lot of questions, and it's a horrible thing. But with victims of crime, there's an actual legal system to go through, where they may or may not get justice. I don't know if that quite, Roger, can you add something
I think
to that?
you've just, you've said it, it's true. It is very hard because it's something that's happened. It's a natural cause, going through the things that we've gone through, that is man-made. Whether they're going to get justice or not, you have someone to blame, and they're going to get hopefully we do pray that they will get the justice they deserve.
It's about feeling heard, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or feeling felt,
It's really important we use the microphone.
All right, or because of the recorder. No, it's just it felt like it's about feeling heard. If there is nobody in the room and I'm talking about my pain, I don't have an expectation that you need to, show compassion to me because I'm telling you.
Yeah.
So this is, I understand, Kathleen, what you're saying about the law, and there's a whole body there that should acknowledge these things, and so there's an expectation from us and from the community, not just you, but the school, the other parents, that this is acknowledged. And I think the acknowledgement, I wonder if it gives, in the case you, some kind of feeling felt. There's some psychoanalysts talk about feeling felt. It's like the parent that acknowledges, I can see you upset, and that provides you some comfort. It doesn't bring your son back, but I want to provide some boundary, and so boundary is restored. It's like an acknowledgement. The boundary has been broken, and boundary now is being restored.
Yes, and I think that's the case on both the emotional level and the legal level.
Yeah.
So the therapist can help you be heard, and the community, and then the legal system can try to repair, to whatever extent it can, the injustice done. Again, that's why I always ask the bigger question: why do we have laws in the first place?
Yeah.
Because we might as well just live as animals. But if we have laws and you break them and you take a life, there is accountability there. So it's a different expectation.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Fiona Smith, addiction therapist. I wonder if you could give us or me a few words on trauma triggering relapse.
Trauma triggering relapse.
For myself, I think it's, sleepless nights. It's very hard because I'm still going through the process. I'm still experiencing it. I'm still going through the trauma. But yeah, it's hard.
I would definitely say that these types of challenges and situations are going to trigger addictive tendencies. And also, and I don't know if you're seeing this
Yeah.
in the community, but I've seen very often where people will have to have something
Yeah.
to help them along. That might range from food, sex, drink, drugs, whatever it is, to pacify these unbelievably traumatic feelings.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be surprising that the incidence of addiction goes
It
up.
has increased, especially with the young people that I work with. Substance misuse has increased, crimes increased, because the fact that that's the only way they can voice how they feel. It's unfortunate the fact that, again, they feel let down by the system, but at the moment, if that's how they have to manage it, it's us as a therapist, is just by holding them through it. I know, some of them have kind of relapsed, some of the ones that I've worked with, but if that's their way of dealing with the process, it's just about helping them manage it.
Right, and I think falling down is part of getting up again. So I think we could expect that.
Yeah, you can.
So basically, you're saying you focus on the trauma before the addiction, before whatever they're using, which has become problematic.
I think both are going to come up. If the behavior is so extreme that you have to deal with that, that's what you would deal with first. Because if they're harming themselves or there's some, then I think you would work with that. But behind that is this trauma,
Yeah.
which is behind most addiction anyway. This is just more recent trauma, let's say, in an event that happened, and then you see the addiction as a result of that. But we could also say that in children who've been traumatized are more likely or can become addicts. So it's sort of similar to that, isn't it?
Because it becomes a coping mechanism.
Right.
Like you said, self-harm, it's a coping mechanism because they're not able to have control of the level of trauma they're dealing with. They're going to try and find something that they have control over, which is taking drugs, taking alcohol, again, self-harm. It is hard, but if that's the way that they have to cope with it, it's us as therapists is to help them manage it and not to tell them not to do it.
And this points to, in my mind, the need for systemic integrative treatment. Because when a trauma happens either on the personal level or on the large scale, where are the services that will help people not to turn to addiction? Because they will self-medicate.
Yeah.
If the services are integrated and available and comprehensive, which is in my work in policy for victim services, that's what it was all about. When the event happens, the services are integrated and available, and they pick up the person, and the person is able to get something. But this is not what happens. People fall through the cracks. They don't go because they don't trust the system.
Yeah.
They isolate, and then they self-medicate.
Yeah, my name's Fred. I work in treatment centre. I've just listened to you. Being a recent victim of trauma myself. My brother was found dead in the treatment centre a few months ago, and I work in the treatment centre. And it's sort of, what I was hearing you doing your work as well, working at Grenfell, I overlook it as well from our window. It's that one goes into a level of resilience and surviving. You talked about not living but surviving and just being in resilience. And that period of surviving before you actually come back into living and being involved working with people at the same time is that kind of strange transference that goes backwards and forwards. And being able to disengage and actually finding a way out to actually come back into living as well. I wonder what your experience of that is, because we're both in very recent phases of it.
Yeah, I think that's more or less how I'm in that process of I have to live, I have to get on with things, but the job and the experience that I have, I'm going to use it to be able to help those that are in need, but also I'm finding that I'm healing myself. And again, I've come across therapists that are like, no, you shouldn't, but to me, by helping those that I understand fully what they're going through, and getting them to explain how they feel. I get that. So if that means I'm helping them, but I'm also helping myself, and if that's being selfish, then fair enough. But to me, that's the way I work.
Yeah, I find it healing. I work in treatment centre. I walk in thinking, maybe one of our clients could be dead this morning. But I find it more cathartic and more healing staying with it. And I was advised to take time away, but I've stayed in it.
Yeah,
I've
been
found
told
it much
that.
more of a healthier process being there
Yeah.
for myself and the clients as well.
I have found I've been told by professionals I need to take time off, but my job allows me to heal. Like I'm lucky to have two different roles. I'm a school therapist, which has not, I have come across those that were impacted with Grenfell, but not as much as I'm dealing with all the service that I've started. So I'm able to shut myself off, going to work and be a school counsellor and work with the young people that I work with whatever they bring. But at the same time, I also put that therapist hat on to support those that are experiencing what I'm going through. So, I'm lucky that I have that. And I'm also blessed to have the support that I have around me from my family, my friends and my colleagues. I'm lucky to have that. So I think that's what's allowing me to heal and also offer the services that I'm able to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Got a question here.
Hi, thank you both. Simon Marks, drama therapist and an addictions counsellor. First, thank you very much for both coming here today and also to share the third speaker's story of Northern Ireland. I'm just sitting here kind of connecting mass trauma. So when I look back over the last 20 years, 9/11, for those people who are based in the UK here, the Dunblane massacre in 96, high school shootings in the States. When I think about when I think about Grenfell last year, I'm reminded of 3 terrorist attacks that happened here. So I'm thinking about the mass trauma that's happening, the way we're watching this stuff unfold on TV. I can even feel myself traumatized now just by talking about it. How do we move on from this? How do we heal? It's not about moving on, it's how on earth can we heal from these things?
This is a really important question, because we are living in a mass traumatized culture, world. And that one of the definitions of PTSD is being exposed to consistent trauma. It's less when you're watching it on the news. In other words, obviously, the closer you are, the more PTSD you're likely to develop. The further you go out, the less, but you're still going to get traumatized. Yeah. And that's why even in this group, hearing this is traumatizing, because it starts to play on all of our inner fears that we're next. What kind of a world do we live in? So we have to process that as human beings, to ask ourselves and check in. What kind of a world do we live in? What are my deepest fears about this? What is being triggered in me? And try to process that and to realize, one of the things about this kind of trauma is you realize that anything could change in a minute. Now, on the one hand, that triggers immense fear, and on the other hand, it's quite liberating, because you realize you can get a phone call and it's over. So which way are you going to live? In constant fear of that phone call? Or doing the best you can with what you have? And I think that's the code of survivors as well. Very aware of everything that goes on, and it's very sad that we have created a world like this, where people do these things. But how are we going to choose to live in it? So that internal process and checking in, I think, is really important. Because how are you going to make it? And then developing that resilience that says, well, today's okay. What else is there? Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely.
Roger, you want to-
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah, I remember last year it felt there was no space in, I'm talking from what happened in London, from various things, it felt like there was no space to process it, and the reaction seems to be now, we'll lay some flowers and sing a song, and I've got no disrespect for that, and I think that's a really important part of community healing, but it almost felt like it was just putting a plaster over it and not giving us enough time to actually realise and feel the gravity of what happened, you know, in Grenfell.
It's because people can't cope with it.
Yeah.
It's the same resistance to be experiencing something with a victim. We can't, it's so hard to handle it. But once you understand that this is the reality of living, there's a toughness that comes from that. There's a compassion, but there's also a resilience, because this is it. You know, so processing where you can and realizing each day that you get is a blessing or a curse. You don't know how it's going to turn out. So you do your best. Because I'm not, and you do your best, and you also try to change things where you can. So if you have a cause, or you have a drive to contribute, that's what you do. And that's where the positive comes. Because the other stuff, you're not going to stop the next disaster. You're not going to stop the next terror. You might stop some of them. But that's an ideal world that we think we should live in, and we don't.
Thank you.
I think this lady over here can.
Yes, I kind of lost my thread. Sorry. I'm not very good with these things. So I just wanted to say, I wanted to go back, really, I suppose. I've worked in the North Kensington for a long time, been associated with the area, lived in the borough for 22 years, and set up an art therapy service when the fires happened. So I've been working there for a long time, and a lot of my clients were directly affected by the fire, and just wanted to say, thank you. Sorry, I did say I was hopeless at microphones. What I noticed is trust. It's taken, even though I've been associated with there for a long time, it's taken a long time for trust to begin to build. I think we're going to be there. I can't remember the name of the therapist who was working after the Twin Towers, and when he was thinking about looking back on his work and realizing that it's for the long term. And I think, I've noticed as a therapist, I've had to really slow down and allow people time. Just time to go at their own pace. And sometimes now, if they can't, I've noticed what's happening is, like on a Thursday, quite often there's a lot of meetings going on at Grenfell, and so they'll come just to come before they go on to the meeting, and it's because it's art therapy as well, there's some kind of regulation that then can take place and give them some kind of resilience to go on to this meeting that they're kind of dreading.
It is. It is. I'm going to be honest. It's very dreadful. I was born and brought up in West London. That's my home. And growing up, knowing that a community was so together, and then all of a sudden, the trust is gone. The trust has gone. The people that I work, the young people I work with, they don't trust the system. They don't trust the local authorities. They don't trust the police, because these are the people that were there, should be there to protect them. And trust is a big thing, because they've seen something happen, and those that were supposed to look after them and protect them, they weren't there. And that is what's sad. So, I've worked with professionals from CAMS to NHS. They're struggling because the community are not engaging. I'm lucky because the fact that I was born and brought up in that community, so I have the upper hand to say to them, listen, we can do this, we can make a difference. So for you to come on and offer that service, thank you so much. That helps, because you are making a difference. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
And I was there,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're trying to make it more than just a one-to-one conversation and debate. Thank you so much. Bernard, I think you had a question.
Yes, I'm Bernard Hornung. I'm a property investment consultant. But that apart, my first 15 years of adulthood was spent in the Irish Guards. And in October 1981, we were bombed. The bus, returning from the Tower Guard, got to Ebury Bridge Road, and just as it was turning right, the IRA bombed us. And I was one of the very first officers on the scene, and it was really, really horrific. But going back to your point of trust, and I think that's what got us through. When I arrived, the bus driver was dead. There were dead people on the road, and 23 out of the 24 guardsmen were wounded, some critically, some slightly. And it was, before the days of mobile telephones and communications. It was a Saturday morning. We had one telephone in the barracks, and I was really fearful of a secondary device going off. The world's press were beginning to rain down on us. Civilians were trying to help. There was traffic chaos, and I was trying to get men out of this bus. We managed. We managed to get them to 7 different hospitals, got them into the A&E, but it went on and on and on. And one of the things that really inspired me that weekend was the way that the Prime Minister cut her weekend short, left Chequers, landed by helicopter in Chelsea Barracks, and I went with Lady Thatcher to every single wounded guardsman in every hospital. And she told me, I'm not going until I have seen every single wounded man. Mm. And I think that really helped us because we stuck together with those men. And my next appointment within the battalion was the regimental signals officer, and it was the signal platoon. And I was with those men for another 2 years. I was their platoon commander. And we kept them in the same barrack room. We kept them all together. And there was tremendous trust. Yeah. I had a guy who'd lost an eye, couldn't read serial numbers, couldn't do his job properly. But that didn't really matter because we knew he couldn't. But we also knew that if we reported the fact that he couldn't do his job properly, he would be discharged, and that would have been the end of him. So we covered for him, and there was such a strong bond and such a strong spirit. But I never forgot the trauma of what I'd come up against. And then it's a bit difficult when you wish for something which actually happens, and you think to yourself, well, the IRA have inflicted this. They've inflicted this damage on a principally a very Catholic regiment, and the Irish Guards are a Catholic regiment of the British Army. So we sort of felt, how are we going to get through this? And I suffered it. I suffered it personally, and I'm sure that the whole regiment did. But in 1986-87, I was the adjutant of the battalion, and then as a senior captain, I was sent to Gibraltar. Now, I hope I'm not breaking the Official Secrets Act, but I think it's beyond the 30-year rule, because it was the 6th of March, 88, that we shot the IRA. I was in charge of ceremonial, discipline, and welfare. And one of my jobs was every Tuesday morning, I had to be outside the governor's residence to watch the guard mount. And in October 1987, the adjutant of the resident battalion turned around to me and said, Bernard, I've just done 2 years in Northern Ireland. The IRA are watching this parade. And I had a complete flashback to Chelsea Barracks. And I knew that if they bombed us in Gibraltar, 300 or 400 people would be killed, because it's a very enclosed space with a lot of hard walls and hard areas, and there would be no escape. So it was really difficult for me because we had to go through a process that we had to continue with guard mounting, because we couldn't let the IRA know that we knew that they were planning to bomb us. And those 6 months were, well, it was the knife edge of danger. And that's the path that we all walked. And the few of us who knew this. But somehow we kept going.
Yeah.
And I took a leading part in one of the most successful counter-terrorist operations. And then March 1988, on that Sunday, we shot the 3 terrorists. At first, I felt...
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I need to stop you now.
All right.
Because this is a very long and powerful story. I can really feel how you're still totally traumatized by this. And that I don't think you've really been heard. I think it would be difficult right now to go through the whole story,
Yeah.
if I'm fair. Could you bring it to a point that you want to make? And I can talk to you afterwards if you want. But I hear the pain, and I think Judith's message and also us talking about trauma has really re-triggered this really terrible experience for you.
Thank you for that. And obviously, you're absolutely right. So I'll bring it to a close. Then we went through the inquest, and the families of the people that we'd shot came out, and I had to meet them and greet them. And there was a tremendous feeling of guilt. So be careful about seeking justice, because whether that was divine intervention or not, I don't know. But when we shot the IRA, I felt justice had been done. I felt really good. But then when I had to meet the families of the people we shot, there was a huge feeling of guilt. What on earth had we done?
You know,
and that's my message.
And that is a very powerful message. And I'll tell you the reason why. Because what you begin to realize, at least in my case, when the 2 boys were sent away to life in prison without parole, yes, I was glad temporal justice had been done. But as you say, I looked at the court, I said, this is a horrible loss for everyone, for their families, for my family, and for what? And that's a bigger question that we look at. We want the justice, but the effects of that, and we begin to realize in that we're all human, and we all make mistakes and make choices that traumatize us and other people. So yes, I'm a victim of what those 2 boys did, and my son lost his life. But what brought them to that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I appreciate what you're saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
Raja, do you want to?
Yeah, that's hard because I've never experienced something like that. But again, like Kathleen said, just sitting here listening to your story, I can clearly see how affected you are, and what it's bringing up for you just sitting and listening to what we've got to say. So, you know what? Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're running out of time, Kathleen. It's
see,
35
we're just
past.
getting started.
I'm sorry,
we're just
yeah,
getting
we
started
could carry
with. You
on
see,
a lot.
this gentleman has now brought us into the. We can now get into the real stuff.
Yeah.
If we had another 2 hours, but we don't.
We don't. So thank you so much, Kathleen Aja. Thank you for having been
us.
there and shared.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.